disk crashes in the New Mexico desert. Oh, that was a weather balloon. Those were crash test dummies. A luminous UFO lands behind people's backyards in suburban Michigan. Oh, that's swamp gas. Cattle are butchered in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest and the West in ways that mystify vets and ranchers. Organs and body parts removed with surgical precision, the bodies desanguinated, the kind of precision that knowledgeable people claim was not scientifically possible or medically possible at that point in time. These people don't know what they're talking about. Those are predators. It's coyotes and wolves. Those are cults, satanic cults, carving up cattle over decades out in the middle of nowhere. Untold numbers of citizens of New York and Connecticut are abducted from their homes or from their vehicles and experimented upon by non-human entities. This transpires at the same time that there's a flap, a massive wave of gigantic football field-sized boomerang craft hovering above suburban homes in the same area of New York and Connecticut. You can't believe those people. That's sleep paralysis. Oh, they just want fame. They don't know what they're talking about. They're not credible. Former government officials come forward as whistleblowers to attest to the existence of a dark program that captures and studies and reverse engineers alien craft and other secrets, attesting to the fact that the personnel in these programs will go to any length to keep it secret. Oh, these are just myths perpetuated by the government for some reason to hide things. Oh, those officials coming forward, they were duped. Those are hazing rituals that are used within government. Nothing to see here. Numerous scientists and personnel close to the UFO topic, they shoot themselves to death, or they throw themselves out windows, or they die of fast-acting cancer, or they walk into the desert and just disappear, vanish into thin air. And still the establishment media plays along. Nothing to see here. There's no pattern here. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. No institution could ever keep a secret for so long. Our sources in the intelligence community insist that there's nothing to this. It's all a myth. Don't trust your lying eyes and your lying brain, because they'll deceive you. What's the pattern here? Underpinning this secrecy, this rejection of human experience, of logic, of intellectual dishonesty, are two key concepts: censorship and propaganda. Censorship to shut down and conceal people's accounts if they're too explosive, to shut down the most logical, most self-evident explanations for certain experiences. Then propaganda to fill the void with acceptable information and talking points. This is a deliberate strategy of controlling what information can be said, released, and influencing what people think. This is a program. This is the use of methods and techniques to extinguish information and ideas that would lead thinking people to forbidden knowledge. In the next few episodes of Catskill Liminal Walk, we're looking at the secrecy and ridicule that have surrounded the UFO topic for a long time. Specifically, we're looking at the interplay among the military-industrial complex, the intelligence community, and mainstream media. How a permanent class in the executive branch of our federal government, working hand in hand with compliant private sector institutions, including in the mainstream media, have effectuated the biggest cover-up in the history of our country, and I believe our species, and how, consequently, we've been sleepwalking through the past 80 years. Non-human intelligences are here, walking among us, interacting with us, and yet we've been conditioned to laugh this off as some kind of big, uncomfortable joke, the outcome of an intentional strategy, formulated and then executed in the name of national security. This is the story of Terry Hansen's book, The Missing Times. I'm Tim Stone. I'm a lawyer in New York. I began my career as a prosecutor, and I write about and investigate the unknown and the mysterious. And now I talk about it too, while I walk around the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. The YouTube economy runs on people clicking a few buttons, is unequivocally free, and takes about 2 seconds. If you enjoy this content, please consider clicking like and subscribe. Terry Hansen was an independent journalist who wrote The Missing Times in 2000. Hansen studied scientific controversies and the politics of mass media. Terry Hansen died in 2014, unfortunately. The world has changed in numerous significant ways, both before and after Hansen died. This includes the explosive growth of the internet, continuing wars, despite a more populist electorate seeking government officials who will not bring us to war, a financial meltdown, a pandemic, and now the AI revolution through which we're all living. Despite all that's happened, Hansen's book and his analysis remain both salient and powerful. Hansen's book is, in many ways, about the state and the corporate media and the interplay between the two, an interplay that is often obscured and opaque. Hansen wrote this book 20 years before a major event that would substantiate many parts of his thesis. Forgive me for this interlude from UFOs, but I want to speak first about COVID and how it demonstrates this interplay between the state and corporate media. The relationship between the centers of power and establishment media, it operates in subtle ways, often out of sight. This includes through informal social relationships, business colleagues, maybe people who are college roommates, maybe people who attend the same church, or maybe they're both Freemasons. But these informal connections are nearly always hidden from view, and their impact is often underestimated.
There is no national conspiracy to buy elections and control America. Now
talk about back to earth.
Conspiracy, but
you don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them.
With that context in mind, it just so happened that Elon Musk bought Twitter and, through an act of radical transparency, shared Twitter's corporate files, documenting its communication with parts of the federal government or federal government adjacent entities during the COVID pandemic. I'm talking about what's known as the Twitter files. So what do the Twitter files show? Direct evidence of censorship, canceling, deplatforming, shadow banning, condemnation, and marginalization against dissenting views about the origin of COVID-19 and appropriate protocols for managing, treating, and curing the virus. Specifically, the White House directed social media executives to target specific American voices who were supposedly propagating disinformation, misinformation, or sometimes malinformation, which is information that's true, but that would have an unfavorable effect if widely disseminated. Some of those media executives had in fact come from the federal government. They'd been a part of the federal bureaucracy. In some cases, they had come from the specific presidential administration with whom they were coordinating, now that they were in the private sector, to implement this censorship regime. We see the role, often underestimated, played by social links between individuals, like-minded individuals, at the top echelons of power, whether it's government power or adjacent sectors like mainstream media power and social media power. The censorship evidenced in the Twitter files was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And I remember reading the Circuit Court, which is the Intermediate Appellate Court's decision, and the factual record, which was pretty astonishing. It speaks to this network of relationships between the government and this social media company, and how officials in the executive branch of the government coordinated and placed pressure on people in the corporate media, including social media, to effectuate the desired censorship, the silencing of individuals, of dissenting voices relating to COVID. So what does this have to do with UFOs? Usually we can only speculate about what's going on behind the scenes to prop up the favored consensus points of view and to silence dissenting voices. In the COVID case and the Twitter files, those files, that serendipitous act by Elon Musk, gave us a fleeting glimpse into the reality of what goes on behind the scenes and the levers of power and how that can lead to the silencing of voices. Many parts of this censorship system that's evidenced in the Twitter files predated this public health crisis, the COVID crisis. When I say system, I'm talking about processes and procedures used to identify unwanted information. But during COVID, during a public health crisis, this system, these processes and procedures got pointed in a different direction. They got pointed at voices, dissenting voices that weren't spouting favored points of view of the government in power at that point in time. The Twitter files show this system used almost as a gun, pointed at dissenting voices, weaponized almost, to snuff out points of view that were perceived as dangerous during a public health crisis. A public health crisis is not the same as a national security crisis. As a result, how a society addresses and mitigates a public health crisis will look very different than how a society and its military address and mitigate a national security crisis. Back to the missing times. Terry Hansen puts forward a framework for how the powers that be in American society, the government, including the military, and closely linked industrial sectors, attempt to mitigate what's perceived as a national security threat from UFOs. This begs the question, what is the national security threat from UFOs? Most obviously is the physical threat from the UFOs themselves, but there are more subtle threats or perceived threats likely at play. Hansen writes about the economic, scientific, and technological change that may be viewed as a national security threat. And I quote him, he says, "Threats to the social status quo due to knowledge of and about the phenomenon." On this topic, Hansen quotes from a 1999 report called the COMETA report out of France by high-level French government officials and military officers about the technological threat to national security that may be posed by the UFO phenomenon. One of the conclusions of the COMETA report was that UFOs are likely extraterrestrial. Coincidentally or not, in the Trump administration's most recent data dump related to UFOs or UAP, the COMETA report, I don't remember if it was in full or in part, was included as one of the files, even though that report was not classified. It was publicly available. What's more provocative about the COMETA report, rather than its ET hypothesis, is when it talks about UFO secrecy. French officials wrote that while it's unclear how much knowledge U.S. military researchers had gleaned from their UFO investigations, there was basically little doubt of the reasons for the protracted secrecy relating to the topic. And I quote from the COMETA report, "It is clear that the Pentagon has had and probably still has the greatest interest in concealing, as best it can, all of this research, which may, over time, lead the United States to hold a position of great supremacy over terrestrial adversaries, while giving it a considerable response capability against a possible threat coming from space." That was written 27 years ago. Viewed through this lens, UFOs, or the topic, implicates two things: America's geopolitical supremacy, or perhaps the West's geopolitical supremacy, and human supremacy over a threat from space, which you have to read as non-human entities. So both American supremacy over its near-peer competitors and human supremacy over non-humans, essentially two playing fields. The bottom line is the perceived stakes of the UFO topic are what can only be described as existential. For anyone my age or older, or even close to moderately old, I'm in my mid-40s, it is not controversial to say that the mainstream media has spent many, many years largely ignoring the UFO phenomenon. And when it addresses the phenomenon, it does so with tremendous skepticism and often ridicule. People who come forward with their experiences, or scientists or academics who express interest in the topic, at least historically, were met with character assassination, or sometimes even worse than that. Even to this day, a traditional legacy newscaster who talks about UFOs inevitably laughs nervously, plays the X-Files theme music, talks about little green men and tinfoil hats. This begs the question, another question begged, is this a natural response, an organic response to information that makes us question our place in the universe? Is it kind of like white blood cells in our immune system responding skeptically to challenging information, to ontologically shocking information? Or is this an artificial response? Is this a synthetic response? Is this the outcome of a deliberate strategy? To answer this question, Hansen says, let's study the controls, or the framework of controls used to manage information with respect to other national security crises. The logic goes, once we've identified those controls in the abstract, we've listed them out, let's look to see if there's evidence of those controls being deployed in the UFO context. And if there's evidence of those controls being used, then we can deduce that this is not a natural societal immune response, but rather this is an artificially induced response, or an outcome from a premeditated strategy put in place to produce that very outcome, namely to conceal and distort the public's understanding of the UFO phenomenon. Think of medicine and how doctors diagnose an illness. A doctor doesn't need a patient to identify the illness. He doesn't need a sick child to say, I have tuberculosis. Please medicate me accordingly. Instead, there are clusters of symptoms that point to a diagnosis. Or think of animal tracking. Perhaps you never see the animal, but you find its prints, its scat, or disturbed brush. These tell an experience tracker not just that the animal passed through, but also its size, speed, and even its intent. We never see the animal, but we see all the evidence of the animal. And then we can deduce that the animal exists, and many of its attributes and even its behaviors. The same is true here. The powers that be, whoever they ultimately are not going to confess that there is an 80-year-long conspiracy to hide UFOs and stigmatize UFOs. They're not going to confess that there's this master plan that's been in place, that was designed and is being implemented for decades now. They're not going to admit that UFOs represent the most profound national security crisis in the history of our country and our species, and that this stuff needs to be hidden at any and all costs. In fact, we may never get that admission. But are we seeing objective evidence of that plan in place and being implemented, of tactics and measures used to suppress and manage information in support of that master plan to which we don't have direct evidence? If we are, then we can deduce that UFOs are indeed perceived and indeed treated as a national security 5-alarm fire, and that there's a coordinated strategy to control and manage this crisis. So to restate Hansen's thesis, we don't have a confession or an admission from those in power that this program, this secrecy, this cover-up exists. But by identifying the tactics and measures used to effectuate the cover-up, we can deduce that it indeed exists. We can deduce, in other words, the contours of an elaborate security infrastructure that's meant to conceal and control information about the UFO topic. And we can deduce that this phenomenon is perceived and treated as the most profound national security threat in the history of the world. Think back to Stephen Lufkin in episode 2, when he talked about people being erased, erasures.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean, erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased.
I thought his account was really powerful. He was describing those in authority erasing human beings who knew too much or said too much. There's no Twitter files for UFOs. We haven't had, and I don't think we will have anytime soon, any come to Jesus type public reckoning with respect to UFO secrecy. In my assessment, the truth will have to be pried from the dead hands of those in power who control this issue, because those people have killed innocent men and women to keep this secret, and they continue to kill innocent men and women to keep this secret. It's totally out of control. Whatever the Trump administration is doing right now with this piecemeal disclosure of UFO files, I think it's in good faith by certain actors, officials within government, but it is the tiniest sliver of the iceberg that we're seeing on the surface. It is the most minute little tip of that iceberg. If and when genuine disclosure ever actually happens, we'll know, because we'll learn how this secret was kept for so long and the victims of this secret who died to keep this secret, because I think a lot of people did die. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back next Friday at 3 p.m. for part 2 of this examination and analysis of Terry Hansen's The Missing Times, as pessimistic as it is. In that next episode, I'll be diving into the 2 components of the secrecy framework that Hansen sets forth, the 2 specific components, and the evidence establishing that they exist and have been used to maintain this cover-up for almost 80 years now. Until then, I'll see you next time on Catskill Liminal Walk.